Afternoon guys, Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School. I thought we would continue on our utilizing resources series today. We had a deer hide, basically a full carcass that was donated to the Pathfinder School, minus the meat of course, by a hunter for our primitives class in mid-November. So I thought what I would do with that is, while I was scraping some of the remainder off the hide from that butcher, I thought I would take the tallow that was left at the base of the tail. There was about 2 pounds of deer fat. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to render that tallow down. And what we're going to talk about is the many ways that you can utilize tallow to your benefit in a wilderness self-reliance situation. So stay with me. We're going to render some tallow down. I'm going to show you how that's done. Rendering is very simple. Then we're going to talk about some of the uses for tallow. And we're going to make a fat lamp today out of a turtle shell. So stay with me. Okay, so we've got our bag here that I stuck the tallow into, or the fat into, from the deer when we cleaned off the hide today. And you can see there's some nice big chunks there. Get the leaves out of it, the blood out of it. But what we're after is these really nice, healthy chunks like this. And what I want to do is chop them up as fine as I can and put them in this pan. So I'm just going to chunk this stuff up into small squares. You can see it's pretty solid in the state it's in right now, and that's because that's the good thing about deer tallow. It solidifies at a pretty warm temperature. So if you're using it for things like candles and whatnot, it will solidify pretty quickly for you. And it doesn't have a very low melting point. In other words, it doesn't melt at a real low temperature either, which makes it really good for candles and things like that, so you don't necessarily have to mix beeswax. So I'm just going to cut this thing into fairly small chunks, and then I'm going to put those chunks into my pan. And I'll do that with probably, a good majority of this fat. I won't use it all. I'm going to save some of it for the primitive class in the middle of November. So I'm going to refrigerate part of this, but I'm going to use a healthy portion of it for these next couple projects with you guys. There's a little bit of meat on this piece of fat. You can see that red. That might just be blood staining, but I think it's meat. That's what we're trying to get rid of, and that's what we're talking about by rendering the tallow anyway. We want to get rid of any byproducts that are in there, or anything that's not actual fat, and render it down to the fat or the tallow. So once we do this process, that will take care of a lot of that. If there's any meat on there, it will come out in the process and we won't have it anymore. Okay, that's a pretty good amount to start off with to do what we're trying to do. Now what I'm going to do with that is I'm going to add just enough water in there to cover that a little bit, because we're going to simmer that water off anyway. This tallow is just a great dressing. Just that raw fat is a great dressing for your metal tools, especially if you got a good high carbon steel knife. It doesn't bother me a bit to rub that tallow into that handle with that micarta, rub it into that metal, rub it into that blade real good. All that's going to do is just help preserve my blade. Okay, so you can see I've got that pot on the fire now. Now I want to boil it down, so I want that high heat right now. I've got a little bit of water in there. You can see not hardly even enough to cover up the fat, and now I just want to get it boiling. Okay guys, so today we're talking about utilizing resources, and we're talking about deer tallow or deer fat. Okay, tallow can be taken from any wild animal for the most part, but the bigger the game animal is, usually the more fat's going to be on that animal. Unless you're talking about something like a raccoon that has a pretty thick layer of fat anyway during the winter. All right, but deer have great tallow. The advantage to deer tallow is that the temperature it takes to melt that tallow is pretty high. Therefore, it makes good things like candles and soaps, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The uses for tallow, very simple uses. Once you've melted that fat or rendered it down, and rendering tallow just means that you've taken all that fat, put it into a pot, boil it down to get rid of all the impurities when you strain it off. Okay, we'll talk about that in a few minutes. Uses for tallow that are bomber when you're in a self-reliant situation like we're talking about now. Number one, it can be used for a leather dressing. You can take that tallow or that fat, raw, dried out to where it's pasty, smear it into your leather boots, put your boots up next to the fire where it's warm so all that stuff soaks into the leather, and it will give you a very good waterproofing and protectant on your leather boots or any other leather equipment that you have. Number two is a wood oil. Okay, if you've made a bow or you have a wooden handled implement like an axe or something like that, whether it's been seasoned or not, you can take that same tallow just like you would do with your boots, smear it onto that handle or onto that bow, set it in front of a heat source, not too close, you don't want to burn it obviously, but you want to get it hot enough so that it's seized into the pores of that wood, and that will give it a very good dressing, a very good protectant. Obviously, your knife or any metal implement that you have can be greased or oiled with that tallow in its raw state or in its cooked state. So whenever I'm cutting tallow with my metal knife, I love that when I'm processing fat because I've got all that grease on my knife to protect it. I don't have to worry about oiling it. The same thing with a firearm. Bone dressing. If you're using bone tools or bone implements, if you haven't dressed them so that they don't dry out to crack, you can use this tallow to dress those bone implements with, and it will help them from getting aged quickly or cracking in the sun. If you have something that's already been aged, you can also redress it with tallow as well. A fat lamp. We're going to talk about that exclusively here in a few minutes in this first video. We're actually going to make a fat lamp from cattail and a turtle shell, a box turtle shell, and I'll show you how it's done in a few minutes. Candles are very easy to make with tallow, and we'll talk about that in another segment of this series on utilizing resources of tallow, and we'll make candles, but it's very easy to do. And then again, lye soap is your last great resource that you can make from rendered tallow, and we're also going to make some lye soap in another one of these series from some of this rendered tallow, and we'll talk about that at that point too. So you can see there's 6 or 7, 8 things that you can do with this tallow from any large game animal or medium-sized game animal that you kill. Even a raccoon, a hog, things like that are going to have that tallow on them. But tallow is a good thing to save. Once you've rendered it down and gotten rid of the impurities, you can pour it into a mason jar or something like that, put it in a cool place like inside my wiki or in the shade, someplace that would be cool like it's fall temperatures now, and it will last for a very long time. At home you can put it in the refrigerator. Out here you don't quite have that luxury, but you could bury it underground in a mason jar or whatever the case may be, and that tallow will be good for a long period of time to use for all the things that we've talked about here. So stay with me. We're going to go process some tallow over the fire right now, and we're going to get to making a fat lamp. Hey, if you look down into our rendered tallow here now that we've got over the fire, you can see some hard chunks here. These are like cracklins. Okay, anybody who eats pork cracklins, and of course it's going to start raining on me now, but if you eat pork cracklins, you know what these look like, and these are just pieces of skin and things like that that don't have fat on them. All this liquid in here now is rendered fat, okay? It's just in its melted state. So now we're going to we're going to scoot that over a little bit and let it simmer for a few minutes, and then we're going to start to strain it off. Okay, so what we've got here is we've got a snapping turtle shell that's been lined with pine pitch, okay? And I've put rocks in the bottom of this thing to take up some of the room because I just want to wick up the oil when I make this lamp. So the more space I have to take up with my oil or with my fat, okay, that's just wasted space. So I'm just trying to pack this in real nice and tight because I've got a rib line or a spinal column that runs right here, and I don't want to capture a bunch of the oil in there. I'd rather have it captured in the area where it's going to go to my wick. And I just need a shell for a ramp for my wick, and I'm going to use this part right here for that. What we're going to use for a wick is going to be cattail fluff. Okay, so we've got our shell with our medium in it. We've got a channel right here that we're going to use for a ramp, and we're going to fill this with our rendered fat. Now I'm going to take a piece of this cattail head, I'm going to bust it off. The bigger wick you use with this stuff, usually the bigger your flame will be, obviously. I don't want the center in there. I'm going to get that out, which would be the stalk. I'm going to pull that out. I'm just going to bust the rest of this up and punk it in my hand, and then I'm going to go ahead and saturate this with oil before I fill this thing up. Grab my multi-tool here real quick. Alright, so generally speaking, we wouldn't want all these lumps of gristle and skin and things like that in our oil lamp. Alright, so I'm going to be real careful to kind of pour this off as best I can without getting that in there instead of straining it. When I get down to the bottom, I may get to a place where I have no choice but to strain it. Just drop the piece in right there. Now I'm going to take this wick and get it in here and kind of get it doused in oil to soak up a lot of the rest of that. Take that and put that right on my ramp, just like that. Pour some more of this off if I can. You can see it's starting to solidify when it hits that cold surface, and that's okay, because once we light it up, it'll melt the surrounding stuff back down. Now what we got left in there basically just cracklins. Okay, so you can see now that that's pretty much solidified in there. I'll pour that as close to the wicking as I can. Get that wick lit on fire here. We'll hope that it's going to stay lit. It should. Okay, we brought our lamp into our wickie now. I hope you can see this. I'm not sure how good this camera shoots in low light conditions, but I've actually put it on top of a stump inside the wickie. I'll get over there beside it here in a second so you can see how well it's burning. Okay guys, I'm Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School, and this has been our segment on utilizing tallow as a resource, deer tallow in particular. And in this segment we talked about making an oil lamp. You can see how much light that thing puts off. You can see me pretty good inside this wickie. The materials that we used for this project were about an 8-inch snapping turtle shell that had been cleaned out, let dry out, and then we pine pitched the inside of it before this segment. We put some rocks in the bottom of it to take up some of the space along the spinal area. Then we filled it with our rendered deer tallow while it was still in a melted state. We put a cattail wick on the ramp at the top of the spine that's burning right now, and we lit it on fire. You know, a lamp like this will burn for a good long time. I used a bigger shell like this. I was going to use a box turtle shell, but I ended up using a snapping turtle shell because, number one, it's very stable. It's not going to fall over when I move it around. It's got a pretty wide base on it. I can set it on the ground, set it on a stump, set it anywhere I want to. I don't have to worry about it wobbling and falling over. Whereas with a more rounded shell like a box turtle, I'd have to set that in some kind of an indention or it would probably tip over. This won't do that. So this is going to make a better oil lamp for this wickie than, you know, a turtle shell would make that was smaller or more rounded like a box turtle shell. I hope you've enjoyed this segment. We're going to continue with our utilizing deer tallow segments and try to make some candles, as well as try to make some lye soap. So stay tuned, stay with me. I appreciate your views, I appreciate your support. I'm Dave Canterbury at the Pathfinder School, and I'll see you on the next video.